Class 2, before we broke up for half term, we were reading this chapter, The Parents, which is where Miss Honey is going to visit Matilda's parents. And she's opened the door and she's a little bit upset with Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood because they're not very friendly to her. And she starts kind of getting a little bit cross with them and telling them off a little bit because Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood are sitting there watching TV and being very rude to Miss Honey. So let's carry on. This chapter is called The Parents, sorry. Okay. My name is Jennifer Honey, Miss Honey said. How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood? Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, What's the trouble then? Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. This, she said, was your daughter's first day at school. We know that, Mrs. Wormwood said, ratty about missing her programme. Is that all you came to tell us? Miss Honey stared hard into the other woman's wet grey eyes, and she allowed the silence to hang in the air until Mrs. Wormwood became very uncomfortable. Do you wish me to explain why I came? She said. Get on with it then, Mrs. Wormwood said. I'm sure you know, Miss Honey said, that... Sorry, Class 2, it's getting a little bit blurry. That children in the bottom class at school aren't expected to be able to read or spell or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds can't do that, but Matilda can do it all. And if I am to believe her, I wouldn't, Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still feeling very ratty at losing the sound on the TV. She was lying then, Miss Honey said, when she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read. Did either of you teach her? Teach her what? Mrs. Wormwood said. To read books, Miss Honey said. Perhaps you did teach her. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you got shelves full of books all over your house. I wouldn't know. Perhaps you're both great readers. Of course we read, Mr. Wormwood said. Don't be so daft. I read the auto, car and the motor from cover to cover every single week. This child has already read an astonishing number of books, Miss Honey said. I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature. We don't hold with book reading, Mr. Wormwood said. You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading books. We don't keep them in the house. I see, Miss Honey said. Well, all I came to tell you was that Matilda has a brilliant mind. But I expect you knew that already. Of course I knew she could read, the mother said. She spends her lifetime up in her book in her room, reading the same silly book. Doesn't it intrigue you, Miss Honey said, that a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement? Not particularly, the mother said. I'm not in favour of blue stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Honey. Miss Hunky. The name is Miss Honey, Miss Honey said. Now, look at me, Mrs. Wormwood said. Then look at you. You chose books. I chose looks. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with the same smug, sweet suet pudding face who was sitting across the room. What did you say? She asked. I said you chose books and I chose looks, Mrs. Wormwood said. And who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left slaving away teaching a lot of nasty children the ABC. Quite right, Sugarplum, Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife it would have made a cat sick. Miss Honey decided if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. I haven't told you it all yet, she said. Matilda, so far as I can gather at this early stage, is also a kind of mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head, like lightning. What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator? Mr. Wormwood said. A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy, Mrs. Wormwood said. Look at that film star, for instance, she added, pointing at the silent TV screen, where a bosomy female was being embraced by a craggy actor in the moonlight. You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures at him, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her. You see if he doesn't. And she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids. Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She'd heard that parents like this existed all over the place, and that their children turned out to be delinquents and dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. Matilda's trouble, she said, trying once again, is that she's so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth talking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe that she could be brought up to university standard in maybe 2 or 3 years with proper coaching. University? Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up in his chair. Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn there is bad habits. That's not really true, Miss Honey said. If you had a heart attack this minute and you had to call a doctor, that doctor would be a university graduate. If you got sued for selling someone a rotten second-hand car, you'd have to get a good lawyer, and he'd be a university graduate too. Don't despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood. But I can see we're not going to agree. Sorry I burst in on you like this. Miss Honey rose from her chair, and then she walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door and said, Good of you to come, Miss Hawkes. Or is it Miss Harris? It's neither, Miss Honey said, but let it go. And then away she went.